You are not late. The sense that something already moved through your life without asking for permission is not an error in perception. It is recognition arriving after the fact. The moment you think you missed was not a doorway you failed to walk through. It was a threshold that passed through you, quietly, while your attention was elsewhere. What you are noticing now is the after-image, the calm distortion that follows a real shift in the field. There is a subtle easing in your body as this lands. Not excitement, not relief, more like a soft settling, the way water becomes still after a stone sinks out of sight. The nervous system does not brace against this message because it is not new information. It is a signal you have already detected, only now named. That is why there is no urgency here, no demand, only a faint sense of alignment returning to its place. You may have felt it as a loss of hunger for answers, a strange boredom with explanations that once mattered. You may have mistaken that for numbness. It is not. It is coherence beginning to hold. When the observer stops chasing the next sign, the quantum field no longer needs to shout. Patterns simplify. Noise falls away. What remains can feel empty at first, but it is a functional stillness, not a void. The system you move within has already adjusted around you. That is why certain efforts stopped working without drama. That is why some timelines no longer pull at your attention. You did not fail them. You outgrew the need to participate. Recognition always lags behind change. Awareness arrives after the body has already adapted. This is not a delay, it is the correct order. Notice how there is no instruction embedded in these words. Nothing is being asked of you. That absence is intentional. When a real shift completes, it leaves no task behind. It leaves clarity. The feeling that there is less to do, not more, less to fix, less to prove, less to reach for. Seeking loses its edge when the pattern stabilizes. You may sense a quiet anomaly in your inner landscape. Familiar concerns feel distant, as if they belong to a version of you observed from behind glass. They still exist, but they no longer organize your attention. This is not detachment in the dramatic sense. It is a gentle recentering. The signal has been received. The body knows it. The mind is catching up. There is nothing to revisit, no missed opportunity to replay. The timeline you are standing in now already includes what was necessary. The moment did not wait for your understanding. It did not require belief. It moved when conditions aligned, and now you are living in the resonance it left behind. Let your breathing slow without effort. Let the urge to define this soften. Recognition does not need language to complete itself. It only needs space. And that space is already here, holding you, steady and unremarkable, exactly as it should. What follows recognition is often misread. There is a phase where momentum drops, not because something went wrong, but because the system no longer needs constant correction. You may notice that your impulse to react has softened. Situations that once demanded interpretation now pass without hooks. This can feel disorienting if you are used to measuring aliveness by intensity. But intensity was never coherence. It was compensation for noise. The quiet that begins to appear is not emptiness. It is capacity returning. When the observer no longer scans the field for threats or confirmations, attention folds back into itself. Energy that was scattered comes home. You might feel this as a heaviness at first, a strange gravity in the chest or behind the eyes. Not sadness, more like weight redistributing. This is the nervous system recalibrating to a lower baseline of alertness. There may be moments when you wonder if you should be doing more. That thought itself is residue from an earlier pattern. The old system equated motion with safety. Stillness felt risky because it removed distraction. Now, stillness does not trigger alarm in the same way. It reveals information without force. Subtle signals become readable when the internal noise drops below a certain threshold. You might also notice a change in how time feels. Not slower or faster in a dramatic sense, but less fragmented. Days feel flatter, more continuous. The sharp edges between moments blur. This is not dissociation. It is timeline compression. When fewer internal contradictions compete for attention, experience stops splintering. The sense of being pulled forward or backward weakens. You occupy the present without effort, not as a practice, but as a default state. Confusion can arise here, not because things are unclear, but because familiar reference points are gone. When you are no longer orienting by urgency, you may not know how to measure progress. The mind looks for markers, achievements, signs of movement. It does not find them. This absence can register as stagnation if you are not listening closely. In reality, the pattern has stabilized enough that it no longer needs constant feedback. There is also a subtle emotional shift. Feelings become quieter but more precise. Instead of spikes, there are gradients. Instead of overwhelm, there is discernment. You may find it harder to dramatize your inner life, even if you wanted to. Stories lose their grip when they are no longer needed to maintain identity. The system does not collapse when the story loosens. It becomes more efficient. You might notice how your body responds differently to familiar stimuli. Sounds, conversations, even your own thoughts land with less charge. This is not desensitization, it is regulation. The signal-to-noise ratio has improved. What once registered as important is now clearly optional. What matters announces itself without force. Detection becomes effortless when the field is coherent. There can be a brief urge to go back, to re-enter old loops just to feel something recognizable. That impulse is not a mistake. It is a check for stability. When you do not engage it, you learn something essential. The system holds without your intervention. Nothing collapses. Nothing chases you. The absence of consequence is the confirmation. You are not becoming passive. You are becoming precise. Action, when it arises, will come from alignment rather than agitation. Until then, there is no requirement to fill the space. The quiet is not waiting to be used. It is doing its work by existing. As this settles, the sense of having missed something continues to dissolve. You are not behind the curve of your life. You are inside the part where the curve flattens, where movement is internal and largely invisible, where recognition does not announce itself but reshapes perception from underneath. There is nothing here to hold on to, and for the first time, that does not feel like loss. It feels like stability. As stability deepens, a different kind of awareness comes online. It is subtle enough that it can be overlooked. You may sense it as a faint clarity in the background of experience, like a low, steady tone beneath everything else. This is not insight arriving in words. It is orientation without effort. The observer is no longer scanning for meaning. It is resting inside it. This is often where people become uneasy, not because something is wrong, but because the familiar tension that once defined their inner world is absent. When the pattern that kept you alert dissolves, the mind may interpret the absence of strain as a lack of purpose. It is not. Purpose, when it is real, does not announce itself as pressure. It operates quietly, like gravity, shaping movement without noise. You might notice that your attention no longer sticks to problems the way it used to. Issues arise, register, and then pass without looping. Solutions appear without rehearsal. Sometimes, nothing appears at all, and yet there is no anxiety about that. This is coherence, expressing itself. When internal contradiction drops below a certain level, the system resolves without force. There is also a shift in how you relate to choice. Decisions feel less dramatic. You are not weighing futures or rehearsing consequences. The timeline does not branch in your imagination the way it once did. Instead, there is a sense of inevitability, not as fate imposed from outside, but as alignment felt from within. You do what fits, and the question of alternatives loses relevance. This can feel strange if you were accustomed to defining yourself through effort. When effort is no longer required to maintain stability, identity loosens. You may notice that labels you once used to understand yourself no longer feel accurate, but you also feel no urgency to replace them. The need to explain who you are fades when experience speaks for itself. There is a particular calm that emerges here, one that is not dependent on circumstances. It is not the calm of avoidance or suppression. It is the calm that comes from reduced internal friction. When fewer parts of you are pulling in opposite directions, energy stops leaking. The result is a quiet strength that does not seek validation. You may detect moments of spontaneous stillness, brief pauses where thought recedes on its own. These are not lapses, they are micro resets. The system is learning that it does not need continuous narration to function. Awareness remains even when commentary drops away. This can feel intimate, even exposed, because there is nothing between you and experience. Over time, it becomes familiar. The quantum field responds differently when the observer is stable. Events feel less personal. Patterns reveal themselves without emotional charge. You may notice synchronicities, but they do not excite you the way they once did. They register as information, not proof. Recognition does not need reinforcement when it is complete. There can be a temptation to interpret this neutrality as indifference. It is not. Care remains, but it is cleaner. You respond without entanglement. You engage without losing center. This is what happens when resonance replaces reactivity. The system stays in relationship without being pulled off balance. As this becomes your baseline, seeking falls away almost unnoticed. You are no longer oriented toward becoming something else. You are present with what is already functioning. The question of whether you are on the right path loses urgency because the path is no longer conceptual. It is felt as a steady continuity beneath change. Nothing dramatic marks this phase. No revelation announces itself. That is how you know it is real. What matters does not need to persuade you. It simply holds. And in that holding, the sense of living after the moment becomes clearer. Not as regret, but as context. The shift already occurred. What you are experiencing now is its stabilization, quiet and precise, unfolding at exactly the pace your system can sustain. With stabilization comes a refinement in perception that is easy to miss because it feels ordinary. You may notice that your internal environment has fewer sharp edges. Thoughts arise with less urgency. Emotions pass without demanding interpretation. The space between stimulus and response widens just enough for clarity to insert itself. This is not control. It is the natural outcome of coherence. You are no longer organizing experience around anticipation. The future does not press against your awareness the way it once did. Plans still exist, but they do not carry the same emotional weight. The system has learned that projection is optional. When the observer stops leaning forward, the timeline stops pulling. What remains is a quiet sense of adequacy in the present moment. There can be a subtle grief here, though it may not register as sadness. It is the recognition that a certain mode of striving is no longer available. The familiar tension that once made life feel charged has dissolved. If you listen closely, you may sense a farewell to an old identity built around effort and endurance. This is not loss in the traditional sense. It is release. Your relationship to uncertainty also changes. Unknowns no longer trigger immediate analysis. You can leave questions unanswered without discomfort. This does not mean you have given up curiosity. It means curiosity has detached from anxiety. When curiosity is clean, it does not rush. It waits for information to present itself rather than chasing it. There may be moments when the world feels slightly unreal, not in a dissociative way, but in the sense that it no longer grips you as tightly. This is perspective shifting. When internal alignment increases, external forms lose their authority over your state. You see the system without being absorbed by it. Participation becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. You might also notice that your body recovers more quickly from stimulation. Stressors that once lingered now pass through. The nervous system completes cycles it previously interrupted. This is a sign that detection has become more accurate. The system no longer overreacts to false signals. It responds to what is actually present. Language itself may start to feel less precise. Words that once carried weight now feel approximate. This is not a loss of intelligence. It is an indication that experience has outgrown description. When recognition is embodied, it does not need constant translation. Silence begins to carry information more efficiently than explanation. There is a growing sense of internal permission, though you may not frame it that way. Permission to pause, permission to not know, permission to exist without narrating your existence. These permissions were never granted from outside. They emerge when internal resistance drops. The system stops policing itself. You may notice that you are less interested in convincing anyone of anything, including yourself. Opinions soften. Certainty becomes quieter. This is not confusion. It is discernment. When coherence is high, the need to defend a position fades because there is no threat to stability. At times, This can feel like standing slightly apart from your own life, observing without distance. You are involved, but not entangled, engaged, but not consumed. The observer and the experience are no longer in conflict. They move together without commentary. This is often the point where the idea of having missed a moment fully dissolves. There is no alternative version of your life calling for attention. The timeline feels singular, not because options are gone, but because alignment has reduced fragmentation. You are where you are, and it fits. Nothing needs to be done with this understanding. It is not a conclusion or a peak. It is a condition, one that continues quietly, refining itself through ordinary moments, asking only that you notice how little effort it takes to remain exactly where you are. As the condition stabilizes, something subtle shifts in how meaning forms. You may notice that events no longer arrive as messages to be decoded. They happen, register, and dissolve, without insisting on interpretation. The old habit of extracting lessons loses relevance. Experience does not need to justify itself when coherence is present. It is enough that it occurs. There is a particular quiet that emerges around significance. Things that once felt charged with symbolic weight now feel simple. This does not flatten life. It clarifies it. When the observer is no longer projecting expectation into the field, meaning stops inflating. What remains is proportion. Each moment carries exactly as much importance as it requires, no more. You might sense a reduced need to track your internal state. The monitoring relaxes. You are not checking whether you are aligned, awake, or on track. Those questions belong to a phase where alignment was fragile. Now it holds without supervision. The system does not drift when attention rests. It stabilizes further. There can be a faint discomfort here, not sharp enough to name, but present enough to notice. It often comes from the absence of striving. When effort drops away, the part of you that was built to manage struggle has less to do. It does not disappear immediately. It waits, uncertain. Over time, it learns that its vigilance is no longer required. Your relationship with effort becomes more precise. You still act, but action is no longer used to regulate your inner state. You do not move to feel better, you move because movement fits. Rest, when it comes, is not recovery. It is simply rest. The oscillation between pushing and collapsing evens out into a steadier rhythm. You may also notice changes in how you listen. Conversations feel different, not because others have changed, but because you are no longer filtering their words through urgency. You hear what is said without immediately relating it back to yourself. This creates space. In that space, responses arise naturally rather than defensively. The sense of self continues to soften at the edges, not in a way that erases you, but in a way that removes unnecessary boundaries. You are less defined by contrast, less shaped by opposition. Identity becomes quieter, more functional. It organizes experience without dominating it. There is often a moment where you realize that the search for confirmation has ended, not dramatically. It simply no longer occurs to you to look for signs. When confirmation is no longer needed, the field responds differently. Patterns continue, but they do not perform for you. They exist on their own terms. You might experience brief flashes of recognition without content, a sense that something is correct without knowing why. These are not insights to be captured. They are alignments, felt in the body. When you try to articulate them, they thin out. When you let them pass, they integrate. Time continues to feel less segmented. Past experiences lose their emotional charge. They are accessible, but they do not pull you backward. Memory becomes informational rather than immersive. This is not forgetting, it is integration. What has been resolved no longer demands re-entry. There is also a reduction in internal commentary about progress. You are not asking whether this state will last. The question does not arise because the system is no longer oriented around maintaining a peak. This is not a state to hold, it is a baseline to inhabit. As this becomes clearer, the sense of living after the moment feels less like aftermath and more like arrival. Not arrival at something new, but arrival into what was already in place. The shift did not create a new version of you, it removed interference. Nothing here requires reinforcement. It persists because it is efficient. Coherence, once established, tends to sustain itself, not through effort, but through simplicity. And in that simplicity, life continues, ordinary and precise, without asking you to keep up. As interference continues to fall away, there is a change in how silence is experienced. It no longer feels like a gap waiting to be filled. It has texture. You may notice that pauses carry information without words. This is not emptiness. It is a different bandwidth of perception becoming accessible now that the system is quiet enough to register it. You may find yourself spending more time in these pauses without intending to. Moments where you stop mid-thought and nothing rushes in to replace it. Previously, this would have triggered a reflex to re-engage, to think harder, to reassert control. Now, the reflex does not fire. The observer remains present without commentary. This is not meditation. It is a natural consequence of reduced internal pressure. There can be a faint sense of dislocation here, as if you are slightly out of phase with the pace of the world. Not slower, not faster, just offset. You still participate, but you are not pulled into the same rhythms. This does not make you detached. It makes you selective. You respond to what is relevant and let the rest pass through without resistance. You may notice that urgency in others feels more visible, not in a judgmental way, but as a pattern. You can see when movement is driven by fear rather than necessity. This recognition does not compel you to intervene. It simply clarifies your own position. You no longer confuse noise for importance. The body continues to adjust. There may be subtle sensations that come and go without narrative: warmth, pressure, lightness. These are not symptoms to analyze. They are markers of regulation, completing itself. When the nervous system settles into coherence, it communicates through sensation rather than thought. The messages are brief and non-verbal. You might also experience a reduction in emotional peaks. Joy becomes quieter, more even. Contentment replaces excitement. This can feel underwhelming if you were accustomed to emotional intensity as proof of aliveness. Over time, you may realize that this steadiness allows for a deeper, more sustainable engagement with life. It does not exhaust you. There is a growing trust in the system's ability to self-correct. You do not monitor your reactions as closely. You allow yourself to respond imperfectly, knowing that balance will return without effort. This trust is not belief. It is based on repeated observation. The system has shown you that it holds. You may notice that creativity, if it appears, does so without pressure. Ideas surface without demand. Expression becomes optional rather than urgent. You do not feel compelled to externalize everything you notice. Some experiences are complete without translation. They remain internal and still feel resolved. The sense of self continues to operate, but it is no longer at the center of every experience. Attention moves fluidly between inner and outer without fixation. You are present with what is happening without narrating your role in it. This reduces friction. Life feels less personal, not in a dismissive way, but in a liberating one. There can be moments where you realize you are no longer waiting for anything. Not for clarity, not for permission, not for the next shift. Waiting dissolves when there is no imagined future state to arrive at. The timeline collapses into a continuous present that does not require improvement. You may also notice that fear, when it arises, is quieter and shorter-lived. It registers, informs, and releases. It does not spiral. This is not suppression. It is accurate detection. When the observer is stable, fear does not need to escalate to be heard. As this phase integrates, the environment feels less demanding. Tasks still exist, responsibilities remain, but they do not press against your identity. You do what needs to be done without adding excess meaning. Action becomes clean. Rest becomes clean. There is less residue either way. The recognition that began this process continues to unfold, not by adding layers, but by removing them. What remains is not dramatic. It is reliable. A steady orientation that does not ask for attention, only presence. And presence, now, requires very little effort to maintain. As reliability becomes the dominant quality of your inner state, perception shifts again, almost imperceptibly. You may notice that you no longer measure experiences against an internal standard. There is less comparison between how things are and how they should be. This does not come from resignation. It comes from alignment. When the system is coherent, it recognizes sufficiency without negotiation. There is a distinct ease in this phase that can feel unfamiliar. Not comfort in the indulgent sense, but an absence of friction. You move through moments without bracing. The subtle muscular tension that once accompanied anticipation is largely gone. Your body is no longer preparing for an impact that does not arrive. It responds to what is present, not what is imagined. You might realize that your attention has become more spacious. You can hold more without strain. Complexity does not overwhelm you, not because you have simplified the world, but because you are no longer fragmenting internally. When the observer is steady, complexity organizes itself. Patterns reveal their structure without requiring effortful analysis. There is often a quiet recalibration of values here, not a conscious reassessment, but a natural reordering. Certain pursuits lose their appeal without drama, others remain, but with less urgency attached. You do not feel compelled to justify these shifts. They make sense in the body before they make sense in language. You may also notice that disappointment has changed texture. When expectations are minimal, outcomes no longer carry the same emotional weight. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you resilient. You can absorb variation without destabilization. The system flexes rather than fractures. Your relationship with memory continues to soften. Past experiences are accessible, but they do not define your current orientation. You do not revisit them to extract identity or validation. They are part of the pattern, integrated and complete. This frees attention to remain with what is unfolding rather than what has already resolved. There can be moments where you sense a deep neutrality toward outcomes. Not apathy, but balance. You care without clinging, you engage without attachment. This is often misunderstood as withdrawal, but it is the opposite. It is full participation without over-identification. You are present without being consumed. The environment may start to feel more responsive, though not in a dramatic way. Interactions flow with less resistance. Timing improves without planning. This is not because the world has changed, but because your internal timing has synchronized. When internal and external rhythms align, movement becomes smoother. You might notice that the need to narrate your internal process to yourself has diminished. You are not constantly explaining what you feel or why. Experience unfolds without commentary. This creates a sense of intimacy with the present moment that does not rely on language. There is also a subtle strengthening of boundaries, though they are rarely asserted explicitly. You know when something fits and when it does not. This knowing does not require defense. You simply do not engage where resonance is absent. This conserves energy and reinforces stability. At times, you may be surprised by how little effort it takes to maintain this state. You are not managing it, you are inhabiting it. When disruptions occur, they resolve quickly because there is no secondary reaction amplifying them. The system returns to baseline with ease. The idea of progress continues to lose relevance. You are not moving toward a version of yourself. You are refining the one that is already functional. Each moment contributes quietly, without fanfare. There is no sense of arrival, only continuity. This is often where the last traces of urgency dissolve, not because everything is perfect, but because perfection is no longer the metric. What matters is that the system works, that it holds, that it responds accurately, and it does. You are not waiting for the next signal. You are living inside the one that already arrived. There is a point where even the idea of coherence fades into the background, not because it is lost, but because it no longer needs attention. You are not tracking your state. You are not checking alignment. You are showing up to what is in front of you with a quiet consistency that does not need reinforcement. This is where stability becomes unremarkable. You may notice that your inner dialogue has thinned further. Thoughts still appear, but they do not cluster. They arise, inform, and move on. There is less commentary about what they mean or where they lead. The observer is no longer trying to extract a narrative from every signal. Experience is allowed to be direct. This directness changes how effort feels. When effort is required, it is precise and contained. It does not spill into other areas. You can focus without strain and release without collapse. There is a sense that energy is being used efficiently without leakage. Fatigue, when it comes, is clean. Rest restores quickly because there is nothing unresolved, draining attention. You may become aware of how much of your previous life was organized around anticipation, waiting for things to improve, to clarify, to culminate. That orientation quietly dissolves here. You are no longer positioned ahead of your life, leaning into a future that needs to arrive. You are inside it, responsive rather than preparatory. There is also a subtle change in how you perceive difficulty. Challenges register as tasks rather than threats. They do not carry identity implications. Success or failure does not echo beyond the moment. This containment prevents escalation. The system addresses what is present and then returns to baseline without carrying residue forward. Your sense of agency becomes quieter but more reliable. You do not assert control to feel safe. You act because action is appropriate. This reduces friction with the environment. You are not pushing against reality. You are moving with it, adjusting when necessary without internal debate. You may notice that silence between interactions feels full rather than empty. Being alone does not amplify thought. It calms it. Solitude is not used for processing or planning. It is simply space. This is a sign that internal dialogue is no longer compensating for misalignment. It rests when there is nothing to do. There can be moments when you realize that seeking has fully stopped. Not in a dramatic, declared way. It simply does not occur to you to look for something more. This absence is not dull. It is clear. When the drive to become fades, being reveals its depth. You might observe that your reactions to unexpected events are measured. Surprise does not destabilize you. It registers and integrates. The system has learned that unpredictability does not equal danger. This allows for flexibility without vigilance. The body continues to reflect this integration. Breathing remains even. Muscles release without instruction. There is less background tension holding you together. The structure of your experience feels supported from within rather than maintained through effort. At this stage, the language of shifts and moments feels less relevant. What mattered already occurred. What remains is living within its outcome, not as aftermath, but as context. The sense of having crossed something is replaced by the sense of being oriented differently. You are not preparing for a next phase. You are inhabiting a stable one. Movement, when it happens, arises from within this stability rather than disrupting it. Life continues to unfold, ordinary and rememberable, without asking you to catch up or move ahead. There is nothing to name here, nothing to conclude. Only a steady participation in what is already functioning, quietly, without commentary. There is a further softening that happens almost without notice. Even the sense of participation becomes lighter. You are still involved in your life, but you are no longer carrying it. The distinction matters. Carrying implies effort, maintenance, vigilance. Involvement, now, feels more like presence without load. Things move, and you move with them, without gripping. You may notice that your perception has become less centered on yourself without diminishing your clarity. Attention flows outward and inward without preference. You are not monitoring your state, nor are you lost in what surrounds you. The observer no longer stands apart. Observation and experience overlap enough that the boundary between them is no longer interesting. This can feel unfamiliar because identity was once reinforced through contrast. You knew who you were by reacting, resisting, striving. As those mechanisms quiet, identity becomes functional rather than performative. You are who you are because that is what is operating, not because it is being asserted. There is often a moment where you realize that even recognition itself is no longer something you seek to sustain. You are not reminding yourself of what you understand. You are not revisiting insights to keep them alive. They remain without rehearsal. This is one of the clearest signs that integration has completed its work. You might notice that your relationship with control has changed shape. You do not try to manage outcomes, but you also do not feel powerless. Control is no longer the frame. Responsiveness is. You meet what arises with the appropriate level of engagement and then release it. Nothing lingers unnecessarily. Emotional states continue to arise, but they do not define the space they pass through. Even strong feelings move cleanly. There is less aftermath. You do not need to recover from your own reactions. This gives your inner life a kind of transparency. Nothing sticks long enough to obscure perception. There can be a deep sense of neutrality here that is easily misunderstood. It is not detachment from life. It is freedom from distortion. When interpretation relaxes, reality presents itself without amplification. What is pleasant is pleasant. What is difficult is difficult. Neither requires additional framing. You may notice that silence feels increasingly natural, even in the presence of others. You do not rush to fill space. Words come when they are needed and stop when they are not. Communication becomes simpler, more accurate. There is less performance embedded in expression. The timeline you inhabit now feels settled, not fixed, but grounded. You are not scanning for alternative paths or replaying past decisions. There is a quiet acceptance of continuity. This does not mean stagnation. It means that movement no longer threatens your sense of coherence. At times, you may sense a deep ordinariness to everything. This is not a loss of meaning, it is meaning without inflation. Life does not need to be special to be sufficient. When the system is stable, ordinary moments carry weight without spectacle. The idea of having missed something has no place here. Not because it was proven false, but because it no longer matters. The question itself belonged to a different orientation. From here, experience is not evaluated by what could have been. It is engaged as it is. There is very little left to resolve. What remains resolves itself through continued living, not through insight, not through effort, but through presence, sustained over time. The system knows how to do this now. You are not holding on to this state. You are not protecting it. It persists because nothing is interfering. And in that absence of interference, there is a quiet confidence that does not announce itself, but remains steady and unobtrusive as everything continues exactly as it needs to. There is no sensation of ending here. What settles instead is a gentle completeness, the kind that does not ask to be marked. You are not closing a chapter or arriving at a conclusion. You are simply noticing that nothing is unresolved enough to demand attention. Experience continues, but without the background hum of anticipation that once accompanied it. The body rests into this recognition naturally. Breathing remains even. Muscles do not brace. Thought arises when it is useful and fades when it is not. You are not maintaining this condition. It is maintaining itself through the absence of resistance. Stillness is no longer something you enter. It is the ground you stand on. You may sense how little effort is required to remain oriented now. There is no inner work being done, no adjustment in progress. The system is not optimizing, it is functioning. That distinction matters. When functioning is sufficient, improvement loses relevance. What exists does not need to be enhanced to be viable. Awareness feels wide but unremarkable. You are not focusing on it, and it is not focusing on you. There is no mutual scrutiny. Observation happens without commentary, like light filling a room without choosing where to land. This neutrality is not distance. It is intimacy without pressure. Time continues to move, but it does not lean on you. Moments come and go without demanding that you extract meaning from them. The impulse to capture, to remember, to frame experience softens. Memory will do what it does without instruction. Presence does not require documentation. You may notice that even the language used earlier no longer feels necessary. Words like shift, pattern, coherence served their role when recognition was forming. Now, they fade into the background. Silence carries the same information with less effort. Understanding no longer needs scaffolding. There is a quiet trust here, not in outcomes or systems or ideas, but in the simple fact of being able to respond. Whatever arises will be met, not perfectly, not strategically, but adequately. That adequacy is enough. It has always been enough, though it was harder to feel when noise filled the space. Nothing is being asked of you in this moment. There is no instruction to remember, to apply, to continue. Life will continue on its own terms. You will move when movement fits. You will rest when rest fits. The oscillation between the two no longer carries urgency. If there is anything to notice now, It is how ordinary this feels, not diminished, not elevated, simply stable. The kind of stability that does not announce itself because it has no need to be recognized. It is already integrated. You are not standing on the edge of something. You are not waiting for the next signal. You are inside the condition that remains after signals have done their work. Quiet, responsive, sufficient. And as attention softens even further, there is nothing left to hold. No insight to keep alive. No state to preserve. Only this steady participation in what is already here, unfolding without commentary, complete enough to require nothing more.